Hello, this is Professor Joseph Holbrook continuing to talk about U.S. Latin American relations. I've already done two recordings, the first one giving the historical background and context of relations between Anglos and Latinos, or the Germanic Anglo civilization versus Latino civilization, going back to the Roman Empire days and wars with the German tribes. And then the second one, we talked about Mexico and the Mexican American War, in which President Franklin Pierce provoked a war with Mexico in order to take possession of California, Arizona, New Mexico, uh, and so on. So now we're going to turn to Cuba. During the same period of time, the United States was very desirous of taking control of Cuba and taking it as a U.S. territory or another state. So the United States coveted Cuba throughout the 19th century, going back as far as Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams. Both viewed Cuba as part of the U.S. A quote, "In due time, Cuba will fall into the American hands like a ripe apple." Move for the annexation of Cuba began in the 1840s and 50s. The desire was to annex Cuba as a slave state, to tip the scales in favor of, in the U.S. U.S. Senate and Congress, to tip the scales in favor of slavery as an ideology. This also will play a significant role in attempts to take over Nicaragua and even the Dominican Republic. Move for the annexation was under the expansionist President Polk, who we've already seen in his infamous role as the instigator of the Mexican-American War. He authorized negotiations to begin for the purchase of Cuba. In the 1850s, both parties, the Whig Party and the Democrat Party, were divided over issues of regionalism and territorial expansion and slavery. 1853, Franklin Pierce, who was a Democrat, openly committed to territorial expansion. In 1856, in the political convention, the delegates voted to include in the platform a statement that the Democratic Party will expect of the next administration that every proper effort be made to ensure our ascendancy in the Gulf of Mexico. This is when the age of the filibusterers begins, or filibusteros in Spanish. And one of the filibusterers was Narciso Lopez, a Venezuelan general who proposed to conquer the island and present it to the United States. He invaded Cuba, but he was defeated by Spanish forces. He was captured and shot in 1851. Under President Millard Fillmore, Cuba was viewed as an eventual national security issue. Franklin Pierce instructed his representative to make an offer to purchase Cuba or to initiate steps to detach Cuba from Spain. This is 1854, almost 50 years before the Spanish-American War. Filibusterers, also known as freebooters, comes from the English term filibuster and from the Spanish term filibustero, but it originated as Dutch, vrijbuter, a privateer, a pirate, a robber, a freebooter. In 1848, there was a caste war in Mexico in the Yucatan. It was a civil war in which the Indian majority rebelled against the Creoles being white, American-born Spanish speakers. In other words, not born in Europe, but born in the Western Hemisphere. And so there was this civil war, the caste war between the Indians and the European Mexicans, or the Creoles, and a final opportunity arose to acquire even more territory in Mexico. The initiative came from Yucatan's ruling elite. They were afraid that Mexico would not be able to, the federal government would not be able to hold on to the Yucatan and they also were concerned that Great Britain might move in during this time of conflict. In the middle of the Senate debate, the caste war was over before they had a chance to vote on whether to accept Yucatan into the United States. There was also a famous scandal around a manifesto called the Ostend Manifesto. There was a negotiations going on between the United States, Great Britain, France to wrest Cuba away from Spain to prevent, for one reason, to prevent the rise of another slave rebellion and another African republic in the Caribbean, similar to what happened in Haiti. And so the quote is, "We should commit treason against posterity should we permit Cuba to be Africanized and to become a second San Domingo or Dominican Republic, with all of its attendant horrors to the white race." Actually, Domingo was referring to Haiti, using the Spanish word name for it. Attendant horrors to the white race. There's a lot of racist rhetoric in the 19th century, and it's very overt and very blatant, and it's articulated by those that were our political leaders in the 19th century. The Ostend Manifesto was an ultimatum, and one of its signatories was the future President James Buchanan, who then became the next president of the United States. In the 1850s, the north of the U.S. objected to admitting a new slave state. Obviously, this would tip the balance of power toward the South within the U.S. Congress. When the U.S. Civil War ended slavery in the United States, it also cooled the ardor of some Cuban landowners and slave owners to join the United States. Up to this point, wealthy Cubans who were slave owners had been enthusiastic about joining the United States, but not after the Civil War. In the mid-1890s, the Caribbean was dominated by the European powers. With the exception of Hispaniola, which is the island on which Haiti and the Dominican Republic are located, every single island was a colony of one of the European powers. The reason why Hispaniola was not was because the Haitians, the first slave population in history to successfully rise up and carry out a revolution, they fought off the British, they fought off the Spanish, they fought off the French successfully over a 20-year period. The Haitian former slaves fought off 3 world empires in order to maintain their independence. In 1913, Europe was dominated by trade with South America, and Great Britain was the leading trade partner for Argentina, Peru, and Chile, and was the number 1 source of imports for Brazil. France and Germany were close behind. The United States was a minor trade partner up to this time, and South America, the United States had marginal influence. This was 1913 in the 20th century. In 1881, the U.S. issued invitations for a Pan-American Security Conference in the aftermath of the War of the Triple Alliance, which was 1865 through 70. That was a war in which Paraguay took on Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. So there was 3 against 1, and tiny Paraguay was a landlocked country, mostly consisting of Aymara Indians and Guarani, and the Brazilians, Argentinians, and Uruguayans ganged up on them. The War of the Pacific was between Chile and Peru in 1879. The Secretary of State, James G. Blaine, issued a second invitation in 1888 and expanded the topics to include trade and commerce. We'll see James Blaine again later in some shady dealings with Hawaii. The parent of the Pan American Union was called the Commercial Bureau of American Republics. It's also later became the OAS, or the Organization of American States. Around this time, tensions arose between the United States and Great Britain over some issues in Brazil and Nicaragua. Serious conflict took place in the Venezuelan Crisis of 1895. This is the first crisis in Venezuela, the first of several, which we're in one right now. It was over a boundary dispute between Venezuela and British Guiana. Venezuela broke off relations with Great Britain and appealed to Washington for help. The United States wanted access to the Orinoco River Basin and to augment its political influence in South America. So it began to exert some pressure on Great Britain, and Great Britain decided to cut its losses, and it accepted the Monroe Doctrine and basically decided to rely on the United States to protect its interests in Latin America instead of acting directly. Securing the Caribbean. Although the United States has been involved in most of Latin America, no place has felt the exertion of the influence, economic, political, military, as much as the Caribbean and Central America. The U.S. goals in the Caribbean were to reduce European presence in the area, the creation and protection of shipping lanes for U.S. commerce, and the construction of a canal in Central America. Alfred Thayer Mahan is a very significant historical character. He was a Navy captain, U.S. Navy captain. Excuse me. In 1890, he wrote a significant book, The Influence of Sea Power in History, in which he argued the thesis that no major empire had ever emerged without a significant navy, particularly in the more modern era, a global navy. And so this book was read by a number of influential figures and U.S. policymakers, including Theodore Roosevelt, who was highly influenced by it. And the book argued that the United States required a two-ocean navy, an Atlantic and a Pacific navy. And to do that, of course, it needed two things. It needed a way to cross quickly from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and it also needed global ports of call, or global navy bases. It needed them in strategic places. What are some strategic locations for navy bases? One would be in Cuba, because it guards the entrance into the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean from the Atlantic. And one was eventually secured in Guantanamo. Another would be in Pearl Harbour. Another would be in Subic Bay in the Philippines. And so we're going to see the influence that that book had on the Spanish-American War and a number of strategic decisions that led the United States into several wars and to take territories in Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and also in Hawaii. Okay, that's all for today. I'll be back at you next week. Thank you.